Welcome to another Wisdom podcast with Myles Blasonato with us today. He's the lead game designer at Blowfish Studios. We're going to talk about DeFi, Web3, game development, blockchain, and game design today. This podcast is brought to you by my podcasting agency. It's called podpire.com. If you want to monetize your podcast the unconventional way, get a bunch of great guests through outreach and scale your podcast and monetize quicker than you ever thought before, you can go to podpire.com. Myles, welcome to the pod. Tell me a bit more about yourself and about what you're up to nowadays.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Charles. Thanks for having me on. It's been just a crazy 16 months for me. I've been in games for about 15 years now. So I started very early on. I started with Flash back when I was like 14, and then moved on to Unity. And I saw the crash from AAA to mobile here, and then just AAA exploding again in the recent years. And so, for me, it was really exciting to see kind of all of that, and seeing where the push now for Web3 has kind of gone. And I've run a website now called the Design Lab blog, and that's where I kind of get the word out there on how do you build a Web3 game, in the correct, I guess, way. There's so many ways to do it that there are philosophies that I kind of use. So that's I guess kind of really quick recap of just kind of how I started. I've always been a game developer. I started very indie, and then moved into commercial and the big AAA studios. And so I've worked across the board, mobile gamification. I've worked on as well. We had to gamify a Malaysian Airlines experience at one of the studios I worked for. So that was really interesting to kind of see all that. And so, yeah, I feel like I've just been really fortunate to be able to have, worked on a bunch of these really interesting projects.
Really cool. And you're behind games such as God of War. How do you design a bestseller like that?
Yeah, well, so God of War. So I actually work with a lot of people in the industry. So I actually worked with Corey Barlog back in the day. And while I didn't work on God of War directly, I worked with a bunch of people that had worked on that. And I just learned so much. At the time, I was at George Miller's studio here in Sydney. And we were doing a bunch of projects. We were working with Avalanche on Mad Max, the game. And so they would send us builds. And I remember they had they took Rico from Just Cause, and they just really quickly skinned him as Max, added in a dog with some dog mechanics, and you just ran around this really big gray box open world, so nothing in it, but it was just to really try out the character controller, what it was like to direct the dog, those types of things. So that was really cool to experience that in the early days, and then Happy Feet too with our partners over at Chrome Studios, which unfortunately have folded since. So that was really, really exciting. And then of course Corey. So Corey was essentially the director of the studio here, and he would be working with myself, and we would be working across those games while we were building like our own mobile games. So mobile was the big thing here, and so we didn't want to touch AAA just because of just the costs and expenses that was gonna set us back with. And the idea was to really start off with doing mobile, move into Xbox. At the time it was like arcade, live arcade, and then PSN, and then work our way up to AAA. So we did that for about a year or so. Um, and then I moved on actually because I got a call to do like level design, because I was hired as a game designer, a junior, but a lot of the stuff that Corey was telling me and teaching me was a lot about level design, and just how, David Jaffe talked about brutality and anger, and really being very thematic in the way that he designs games. And you might even remember in God of War, when you open up a chest or even just opening a door, you've got to mash the button to really do that. And a lot of that game is very thematic, like that you feel the anger just opening up the chest, right? And I think that's a very important principle. And I learned this stuff, in the early days. So I was very fortunate to have learned from really strong system designers that really like to build these immersive simulations. And so, yeah, it was just crazy experience to work with Corey. He taught me so much about, game design from the stuff that he worked on. He's also um, very in touch with the industry and people in the industry. And so a lot of things in terms of level design from like The Legend of Zelda, just showing you a puzzle first before the solution. Because if you come across the solution, you're just like, what does this even solve, right? So just using the camera and things like that. So really, really exciting time back then.
And what do you have to say about groundbreaking games such as World of Warcraft, which I spend 40 hours a week of my younger life from 12 to 16, being the best torrent hunter, and well, actually being the best PvP and on my full server. What do you have to say about that game? What do you have to say about Call of Duty and modern hits
Mm,
such
mm.
as Rocket League, which I would play recently?
Oh yeah. So I mean, there's definitely a place for the more competitive games. And I really dig those types of experiences for Web3, and we can talk about that a little bit. But in terms of like an art form, I think one of the things that I feel like is missing from modern games, and definitely World of Warcraft had this, and I think it kind of lost it. But I think with Web3, there will be a push for MMOs once again very soon. I think MMOs are the way to go if you want to build a really sustainable Web3 economy. But were a lot of security issues, right? Like you could do dupe hacks and get like multiple assets in the game. The auction houses and things like that, and the marketplaces that people used were filled with hackers, and it was really dodgy. When you have peer to peer, that stuff doesn't really happen, right? Because you can see it on the blockchain and things like that. So I do think that that's going to be something that comes to a game like World of Warcraft, but you can already see like in the numbers that they have to have. It's very important to have a content pipeline that continually makes the game fresh. There was a really cool GDC talk from the creative directors on Maple's story, and these guys have just become massive in the industry. Billions and billions market cap, and they talked about how to build a sustainable Web3 game, and they didn't even talk about a Web3 game. They talked about Maple's story and how that game has been going on for 20 years. They release more updates every year than anyone else, and just talking really about that content stream. So I think that that's where you would need to look at for a game like World of Warcraft in terms of like how do you get an MMO or an online game like that to have legs and be sustainable? That's like the key part. But then you have to go deeper, right? So back to your question on these groundbreaking games. I think 2023 was a special year for the games industry. If you take a look at all of the game award nominations from Tears of the Kingdom, Baldur's Gate 3, Alan Wake 2, which is just an amazing game. If you haven't played that one, you've got to try that one out. Um, but I feel like we're really coming back to theme now. Yeah, I feel like we're starting to really understand that, as a game designer, it's like a director for a movie or a writer. You have something to say, an experience maybe you've gone through in the past, and you want to express that to players so that they can learn from the things that you learned from in those experiences. And so you try to come up with a premise or a concept for a game that allows players to go through a similar experience, all of the right essential elements, so that they get that character arc or that character growth by the end of it, the same way you would have character story of Star Wars, or the same way you would as a person, right? Going through change yourself. And so I think that we're going back to that. And if Alan Wake 2 is an example of this and how thematic that game is, like the character controller, and without giving too much away, but when you're playing the FBI agent, you really feel like an FBI agent, like finding clues, piecing them together, using your place in your mind to kind of piece things together. It's a very strong metaphor. right? And then trying to track down what's actually happened. And I think that this is important. It's why games like, Legend of Zelda, Metal Gear Solid, why they are so strong, because you really feel like Snake, right? Like when you're sneaking around, the sentries are like, huh, what was that noise, right? And so it's your actions that the world acknowledges, something that Valve does very strongly. Gabe Newell talks about, if someone shoots at a wall, the wall needs to acknowledge that, right? And show the bullet hole in the wall. It can't just be you doing stuff in the world and then the game doesn't react to you. And I think this is like a lost art form that I wrote a paper on recently. It's like immersive simulations. And if they are a genre or a paradigm. And my paper was arguing that it's actually more of a paradigm, because if you use the same lens, you apply it to a game like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. I mean, you just see immersive sims in that, right? You just see Deus Ex, and you see what Arcane does with Prey, picking up things, throwing them around, and combining systems together to have, a way to overcome an encounter or an obstacle in any way that you can think of. It's not just, you know, go up to the door, use force push to open it. There's no other way you can open it. And so it's this thing. And I think that that's where this year has been a really great year. Very thematic, strong character controllers. You're really feeling like you're going on this experience. And if the top games of the year were anything to go by, I think this year is going to be even bigger. With the push of Web3 making things even more immersive, I think it's going to be exciting. Yeah.
And for those that don't know, immersive sim is like choosing your character. You start World of Warcraft, right? And you can be a warrior, you can be a hunter, demon hunter, and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, it seems that League of Legends had that, but you didn't get to customize your character too much. So that's, I mean, my brother plays LOL quite a lot, but that aspect of the game pleased me a bit less than World of Warcraft. Not only choosing my class, um, a hunter, right, but also choosing my specialty, a beast mastery hunter, choosing my pet, uh, choosing my equipment. Why do you feel LOL got so popular so fast?
Hmm. I think it's because of all of that, right? It's like the first big online immersive simulation. Now, without going too much into it, like when we talk about immersive simulations, we go back to I'm gonna talk about first ever immersive sim game, right? In terms of a genre. And this was Ultima Underworld, the Stygian Abyss, right? So this is the first kind of big or the first kind of proper immersive simulation. When they built that game, yes, it was based off the Ultima IP, but what Warren Spector wanted to do was take the flexibility of Dungeons and Dragons in terms of checks and things like that, and allowing the player to essentially live a second life in this other world. Bring that over into video games. How can we do that? And what I really loved about Warren Spector's implementation, it moved away from commands, which at the time, from text-based adventures and things like that, you would essentially type in what you wanted to do and see a little bit of an animation. And because of technology, that's kind of where MMOs went. Like you click a thing, click on an enemy, and you just watch like an animation. Whereas what Warren Spector did with Ultima Underworld was he actually mapped the actions to the mechanics of the game. So you would attack, you would actually cast spells, you would actually do it like a move to actually cast spells, even picking up objects from the world, which again, it's one of those things you have to really analyze. But right in today's society or in today's gaming society, when you play a game like this, it's 3D. So you click on a 3D object, and then there's a 2D version in your inventory, right? But in the old Stygian Abyss, the whole game was 2D using billboarding and some other techniques to make it like the old Doom, where it was a 2D game with sprites, but you moved around like a 3D space. But everything was 2D in terms of what it looked like. And so you could pick up a bag or a sword, drag it straight into your inventory, and you just see it go in there. So it felt very connected. We call this direct controlling UX. And so there are mechanics like a simulation needs to have consistent rules. Okay, so when we look at Ultima, it's one world. You're underneath this like cave system, and there's a whole society that lives under this thing. When we look at Prey, right, the Arcane's 2017 game, you're set in a whole ship, and that ship is actually simulated. You know, in that game, the ship you're in actually rotates, and if you look out the window, you can see the position of the sun moving. That's like the level of like simulation the world is set up to have. Because once you have, and they've got to be thought of in a smart way, right? Like once you have these pieces in, then the player's actions can then interact with those systems. For example, when that ship is, you know, facing away from the sun and things get darker, can you now hide more? Right? Is this a thing that you can now do, which makes the game more immersive, right? Because you just think of a solution. How can I get through these enemies? Well, if I just wait at the right time when the ship is turned, I can then sneak through, right? Um, and I think that it's this type of mentality that we slowly kind of lost as games became more scripted, more authored, more linear. And now we're going back to these more open, no real tutorials. Breath of the Wild just kind of throws you in there with all these systems, and you just got to figure it out. And I think that that's now coming back to the fun that the games of the past kind of had. It's that magic that the older games had that I feel like developers now that they're getting older, that were younger, grew up with these games, they're starting to now experiment with these things and they're starting to figure it out. So really exciting times for immersive games to come back. And I think we're going to see more games like Breath of the Wild, like Tears of the Kingdom, like Elden Ring. I think we're going to see a lot more of this stuff moving forward.
And where does Web3 come into it? Like, what companies
Mm.
have made nice use of Web3 to monetize their game and make their players more loyal?
Yeah, so moving into Web3 has been a real eye opener for me because I'm very systems design. Like to me, I think everything is a system. I see things this way. I start off as a system designer, but if you just go to the gym, for example, there are systems set up in place there. And if we were to, and I'm going to give you now kind of, um, I guess, a little bit of game design on how we could do this for Web3. But let's take a gym and you go into a gym. You have three types of profiles, player profiles. You have the person that goes to the gym, the customer, you have the builder. So these are the manufacturers that build the exercise machines, right? And then you have the investors. So these are either business owners or people coming in with money. There's three types of people that engage with an economically sound system, right? It means that there is money to be made here. And it's just like looking at the stock market. When you look at the NASDAQ, or if you're looking at things like ETFs, they give you the top companies in that space, things like that. In a very similar way, an investor needs to see those trends in an economy like this. And so when we look at a game, we can't just make a game now for a player anymore, right? Or looking at a game in terms of, mid game, early game, and late game. We need to really look at it now as here's the experience that players are going to have. Here's the experience that developers or builders are going to have. And here's an experience that investors are going to have. That's why when you see a Web3 game, you have things like a meta layer or like a website that players can interact with when they could just go straight into the game. Well, why is that? That's because investors don't necessarily need to know about how to make a game or how to build a house if they want to invest in it, right? They can invest in a REIT on the stock market, right? Put money in a REIT and get some money from real estate. And so they don't need to know how to build a house. Same thing for a Web3 game. They don't players, investor players don't necessarily want to learn the intricacies of the game mechanics themselves and actually play the game. They just want to invest in the economy that the game is being situated in. And so that there needs to have like a little bit of a layer between the game and the website or something else to have them interact with it. And then UGC, man, like that's like the big one. That's why Minecraft is the best-selling game of all time. I think Minecraft is the number one example of what a Web3 game could be. It's just minus the Web3 elements, right? But if you take that, you take everyone's collective, um, expression on building things, you allow them to monetize on those things, and you allow investors to invest in those assets that are being built. I think you now start to come into a system that feels very familiar. It's very authentic into how people invest and build and sell and how the world works. But now you need the secret ingredient is to wrap it in a theme, okay? In a theme that makes sense for a video game. It's not just about here's a game about painting pictures and then like you can now sell them as NFTs or anything like that because it doesn't make sense thematically. If you played a struggling artist and you started off not understanding how to paint and then slowly got better and actually started to sell paintings in the game to other players, and other players were buying that stuff. And every time you made X amount of sales, you would proc a cutscene that would like level you up or take you to the next bit of the story. I think that that's where things need to. We need to take the idea of a real world economy, but we need to contextualize it in a theme where players can still learn.
Right. And in your case, how do you split your time between your current company that you founded and Blowfish?
Yeah. So the company on the side, so the Design Lab blog is trying to, take all of the learnings that I've had throughout my career, all of my current learnings on game design. I'm very careful that everything is very universal. So it's just talking about Web3 game design in general, giving some tips on game design, how to combine the two together. So for me, it's more of an outlet to kind of document my findings and my learnings while working at Blowfish. So, I'm really Blowfish all the way, but, I'm putting out content every week on just trying to educate people on Web3 games. They're not as bad as people are saying. It's just that the experiences that have come out of Web3 are still in the early days. And so we just need time to kind of iterate, experiment, really figure out how to do it properly. And I think that that's coming very soon. I think that our Phantom Galaxies is our big AAA flagship at Blowfish Studios, a big AAA game that we've released, and we've had really good reception to that so far. We know that the Steam players are still very adverse to Web3. And there's this like kind of evil annotations around it, but slowly, they're coming around as well. I don't know if that means that Valve and other bigger companies are going to follow suit and essentially allow Web3 games onto their platforms. But Sony's already doing it. Android already allows it. So like with Sony, they've already put up a patent to get those things through. So it's only a matter of time before these games can get onto console as well. So yeah, so that's pretty much it, man. Like in the mornings, weekends, I work it on my blog, and during the week, I'm working on some big Web3 games.
Where can people find out more about you, Myles?
For sure, for sure. So definitely check out blowfishstudios.com for any of the big game stuff that's coming out. But definitely please check out the blog too, the designlab.blog. You can also find me on socials at Myles Blasonato. And yeah, just check out some of the Web3 content. Definitely check out Web3 games. I think it's the next kind of frontier in terms of interactive entertainment. So I'm very keen to kind of just get the word out and share that with people.